Okay, so power is simply work over time. So we're taking the amount of work that was performed and we're dividing it by the amount of time that it was performed for. So power is kind of like another thing that's pretty important. So we'll start off with, like, in general, we have there's two ways we often characterize power in athletics and in training. We have what we refer to as like sustained power or total power produced, and then we have what is referred to as peak power. Peak power is if we graph your power production over any given period of time, we'll often see a graph that kind of looks like this. It's like this wavy, it's generally not going to be very uniform. It's going to have a lot of peaks in it. So when we talk about peak power, it's like, hey, like, what are the highest levels? Like, what are the mountains? You know, what do those peaks look on that graph? And then when we have like total power produced, that's where we would take the total. Generally, we take like the average of like what was your average power produced, or we'll look at what was the total power produced, and we take the area under that whole curve. We integrate over that curve, we find the area under the curve, and that gives us total power produced. The main metric we often use for power production is generally going to be watts. It's going to be watts of power, and a watt is simply 1 joule per second. So if you're performing power at a sustained rate of 1 watt, every second you're performing the equivalent of 1 joule of work. And remember, 1 joule, you're simply applying a force of 1 Newton over a distance of 1 meter. So if you're performing 1,000 watts of work, you're doing 1,000 joules every second. Perform a peak power of 1,000 watts is a lot. And it's generally not going to be something you can sustain for very long. When we look at like some activities like jumping, sprinting, something like that, often for very brief periods where you have these really high impact forces, these very high deceleration, acceleration rates, and we're going to get into this more later as to why this occurs. But we often see power production will often peak into the thousands of watts over a period of a split second. Whereas we generally don't see that type of power production during slower movements, simply because the rates of deceleration and acceleration are not going to be high enough over a short enough period of time. But it's common for people who are very strong to have peak power output of anywhere from 500 to 1,000 plus watts for weight training exercises. A lot of times, like more aerobic endurance events, the total power produced is going to be extraordinarily high, and that's why these events are very taxing on the body in terms of metabolic and energy demands. But often the peak forces are not going to be very high. You're not going to see very high peak power production during like during a rowing or a cycling exercise when people are cycling over these extremely long distances. But the total energy production to sustain that power output is going to be extraordinarily high because there's just so much of it. But generally, like that's going to be power. Usually, the events that generally produce the most power are going to be those things in athletics that involve the most muscles of the body. So you generally see extremely high power outputs with events where the weights are where you have like pretty high acceleration rates and you have like moderate loads being involved. So moderate loads would be like sprinting, jumping, Olympic lifts. Throwing like moderately heavy implements. That's generally where you're going to see like the highest rates of power production. So anyways, that's power in a nutshell, and then we'll move on with kind of some of the biological considerations of some of these concepts.